What is an existential challenge to one country is barely a passing concern to others. Lithuania, Poland, and Romania are in near panic about Russian activities in Ukraine, while Portugal, Italy, and Ireland insist that the real issue is the financial crisis. And Germany and the Netherlands are primarily focused on forging new trade deals with economies beyond Europe. There is no commonality, no agreement, and from that minimal coordination, Europe is becoming overwhelmed with itself. Within that rather dark and murky forecast, there is, however, one relatively bright spot. Not everyone in Europe took full economic advantage of Bretton Woods and branched out to become an international economic power. Not everyone handed over all meaningful levers of their defense policy to Washington. Not everyone in Europe is so enmeshed in the European Union that the Union's end spells utter disaster. And not everyone in Europe forgot how to have kids around 1965. One country has stood somewhat apart, and as such it will have less vulnerability and more options than the others. Irony of ironies, that country is the one that came up with the very idea of the EU in the first place, France. It shouldn't be a surprise. Just as Bretton Woods was America's strategic policy for fighting the Cold War, the EU was France's strategic policy for taking advantage of Bretton Woods. Alone among the major powers, Washington and Paris never hitched their economic systems to what were ultimately strategic gambits. France's economy is only half as dependent on exports as Germany's. It is among the world's foremost agricultural exporters. By European standards, it has a fairly healthy demography, still benefiting from a fairly robust birth rate. It is the only country besides the United States that floats an aircraft carrier worthy of the name, even if technical problems limit it to nothing more than brief regional deployments. Its use of nuclear energy keeps it largely independent of petroleum markets. What petroleum it needs, it can source from nearby Algeria, a country with which it enjoys reasonably positive relations. Its position on the western end of the NEP and its Mediterranean shoreline both reduces its exposure and widens its reach. Unlike Germany, where needs are legion and the places that can satisfy those needs are scattered, French needs are limited, and solutions to those needs are nearly all local. All of the violent chaos likely to erupt involving Sweden, Germany, Poland, Russia, Ukraine, and Turkey is on the far side of Europe. And just in case all else fails, it has nuclear weapons. Not can make them in a pinch like Sweden or South Korea, but already has them like the United States. Unsurprisingly, France is the country that the Germans take most seriously. Between its low needs and high leverage, France has not just the greatest capacity to shape Europe, but the greatest wealth of tools with which to do so. If there is to be some remnant of united Europe that will survive Europe's chaos to come, it will be France at its head. If there is to be some power that rises from the ashes as Europe tears itself apart, again, it too will be France. European history has been on hold since the Americans restructured the world in the 1940s. Centuries-old competitions were simply smothered under the happy blanket of American security and global trade. That era is rapidly coming to a close. In its place will be a host of states terrified of a reawakened Germany, a Germany that will have to fight for its economic well-being, a Russia desperate to harden its external boundaries, a justifiably paranoid Poland backed by a no longer neutral Sweden, and a Turkey eager to carve its own sphere of influence out of the EU's and NATO's remains. Will all of these evolutions result in wars? Probably not. But it truly would be stunning if none of them did.
There have been a number of protests and a number of schools and police officers have been burned in the last couple of days. The triggering event is the police killed a kid, I want to say it was like 15, 17, something like that. And so there's been this spontaneous uprising of violence. We haven't seen activity like this since 2005. Back then, similar cause. Police killed a couple of kids that were hiding from the police, and it triggered riots that lasted several weeks. Too soon to know if this is going to be one of those sort of explosive, protracted events, but it's worth considering because France is not like a lot of other places. Now, here in the United States, we obviously have a checkered past and a checkered present when it comes to issues of race, and it's part of the conversation all the time. And there are members of a number of minorities that are represented in governments at all levels, especially the national level. We've even had a black president. That is not the situation in France. In France, they made the decision back after the revolution that ethnic conflict was so extreme that they had to redefine what the term French means. So it didn't matter if you were Catalan or Basque or from Paris or Marseille or Alsatian, it didn't matter. Everyone was French now. And all of the various groups that had been part of a series of civil wars and disturbances in France going back a millennium, all of a sudden were considered all of the same family. And in the modern age, what that means, it's illegal, unconstitutional even, to collect ethnic data on the French population. And if everyone was just Basque or Catalan or French or Alsatian, that might be okay. But that is not the France of today. As part of the colonial legacy, a number of people from their former colonies have moved to the mainland France, metropolitan France, and even have French citizenship. In fact, in some cases, their great-great-grandparents had French citizenship. So these are not people who arrived recently. But because it's illegal, unconstitutional, to collect any sort of racial data, they exist as a sort of second class that is, from the American term, almost undocumented because of the racism that exists in all societies. So in the case of France, they don't even know how big the racial problem is. It's probably about 15% of the population is non-ethnic French, but legally French. And that has institutionalized the racism in a way that we have a really hard time processing here in the United States. In many cases, it's more similar to what they've got in Brazil. You've got an urban center where the ethnic French live that is relatively well off, and then you've got a ring of suburbs that is more akin to slums where most of the non-ethnic French who are still French citizens live. And because the French can't even do the first step of collecting data in order to get a good grip on what the size of the issue is, it's really hard for the government to apportion resources outside of law enforcement. So in many ways, parts of France, even in their major cities, resemble a little bit of armed camps. And that makes it very easy for violence to erupt because it's not a big reach for people who are the subject of living in the armed camps to rebel against the people who are supposedly providing law and order. Now, for those of you who know my work, you know that I'm very bullish on France in the long run. They never bet their economic, much less their political system, on globalization, and they never integrated their economy into the European Union. They've always seen themselves as a step apart, and that means that they've sacrificed a lot of efficiencies and a lot of the reach they could have gotten under the globalized era in order to maintain a more nationally oriented economic system. That comes at a big cost. But it does mean as globalization breaks down that the French don't have that far to fall. Because if the EU were to dissolve tomorrow and freedom of the seas would cease to exist next week, the French economic system is largely in-house. They're a massive producer and exporter of agricultural products. They've got energy nearby in both the North Sea and in Northwest Africa. There are several countries removed from the Ukraine war and what's going on with the Russians. And their primary economic competitor is also their primary political partner in the current environment, and that is Germany. And unlike the French, the Germans have gone whole hog on globalization to the point that we're already seeing massive problems there when it comes to exposure to the Chinese systems or the Russian systems or whatever. The French have none of that. And then finally, the French demographic is strong because there's a neonatal sort of policy set that encourages people to have kids in large numbers, giving France the healthiest demographic structure in the world outside of New Zealand. And the United States happens to be third in that regard among the advanced countries. So all of these things add up to a strong prognosis for the French over the medium to long term. But the racial issue is absolutely France's Achilles heel, and we're seeing that boil up right now.
Not forecast. I don't think any of those are very likely. I'm trying to come up with something that might actually has a slight chance of actually happening. I could see France leaving the European Union.
Wow. Okay. We'll talk again. So
for them, it was always a political project, not an economic one, and clearly it's now starting to cause some economic pain.